as school shootings are becoming more and more common, we clearly have to be much more proactive rather than reactive in preventing future atrocities.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Hi, my name is Allison Paolini. I am an assistant professor of school counseling, and I am the program director at Arkansas State University. I am so excited to be here today to talk about school violence as well as best practices to mitigate school violence.
My name is Ralph Griffin, and I'm a resident here at the Madison, which is a senior citizen for elderly citizens. And I enjoy the place here. And since I've had so much teaching experience with kids, probably experience with people also, because I was a seminary student. I went to the seminary in Michigan, in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And I also attended part of my studies to get certification at the University of Michigan. And so I'm very happy to cooperate with what you have to do. Can we discuss why school shootings happen? What factors lead to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great question, Ralph. And I'm so glad that we're going to talk about this because it's such a relevant topic, right? We know how pervasive, gun violence is. It's definitely a worldwide global epidemic, right? Yes. It's becoming much more common universally. We know that. And in terms of school violence, there are really three predominant causes of school violence, right? So bullying is really one of the leading causes. There's also side effects of psychotropic medications, as well as retaliation and revenge. So those seem to be predominantly the major causes of school violence. In terms of side effects or non-compliance, because that's also problematic, right? So there are some kids who are diagnosed with mental health issues and they're prescribed medication. However, maybe they're not taking the meds, right? Maybe they're not taking it every day. It's inconsistent. And then we also know that some medications have side effects, right? Which exacerbate feelings of rage, anger. They may cause hallucinations of some sort, right? So that is really in terms of side effects of psychotropic meds. In terms of bullying, because we know how problematic bullying is, right? It has a monumentally negative impact on students really across the board. So academically, socially, emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally. And as you know, right, working in education, so bullying is defined, it is really unwanted, it is aggressive, and there's an imbalance of power, right? So the perpetrator has more power than the person being bullied. And typically it is repeated, right, over and over again through intimidation, and it has long lasting psychological effects, right? Yes. We know that it leads to increase in dropout rates, right? Like kids don't want to go to school anymore. They have anger, they have resentment, they don't feel so good about themselves, right? There's sadness. And they definitely want to retaliate. They want to hurt the people who are ultimately hurting them, right? And so they're lashing out in these really unhealthy ways.
Right.
And we know that bullying can also lead to mental health issues, right? So depression, anxiety, a decrease in academic performance. Usually kids who are struggling with bullying, they're much more likely to struggle with some sort of mental health issue, behavioral issue. And we also know, interestingly, that most people who are carrying out school shootings, they have some sort of history of suicide attempts, They may demonstrate depression or desperation prior to an attack. So these kids feel like they ultimately have nothing left to lose, right? And then revenge is another real problem. So like we said, many of these kids who are carrying out these acts of violence, they feel isolated, they're sad, they're angry, right? Perhaps they've experienced loss, they're frustrated, they're embarrassed, they're being bullied time and time again. And that then can in turn lead to blame. So it's this vicious cycle, right? Which can then lead to homicidal ideations. And a lot of these kids think that violence is one of the only ways then to really solve their problems. So most of these perpetrators are really targeting those who they believe have harmed them or wronged them in some way, shape, or form. Okay. And they want these other people to be in as much pain as they are. Mental health, like we talked about, or lack thereof, right, is really a major concern. And we know that most of these school shooters are struggling with either a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issue. They're looking to control. They want to feel empowered, right? Maybe they don't feel a sense of control over their own lives. And so they want to have this sense of control in this mass chaos. Access to guns, we know, is clearly also very problematic. Most of these students who are carrying out these acts of violence, they are getting the guns from home, from the homes of family members, of friends. Perhaps they're purchasing them online without having a extensive background check. A lot of these school shooters have had challenging lives, right? So typically, kids who are excelling academically, right, they have a lot of friends, they're doing well in their extracurriculars. Those are usually not the students carrying out the acts of violence, right? So most of these kids, again, they may lack a strong family support system, peer support system. They're struggling with some sort of mental health issue. And so they're perhaps lacking effective coping skills, right? And so then again, they're lashing out in these really unhealthy ways. Most of them are also posting threatening messages on social media. So this is something to be really mindful of. We have to do more with monitoring social media because they are showing pictures of guns and weapons and so on and so forth. There's definitely a fixation there, right, with violence. There is a preoccupation. Many of these students are making, threats against themselves or hurting others. There's a lack of support and they have serious behavioral issues. So again, those are some of the major reasons I want to say as to why the school shootings are happening. And I know you also asked in terms of the factors that have led to school shootings. And I know that you're aware of much of this because you have such a wealth of experience as an educator, right? So
Yes.
We know that this is a really complex issue. And there's multiple factors, I want to say, that have caused this uptick, right, in school violence. First and foremost, there's definitely today, and we know this, there's a breakdown of family structure, right? So we know that more parents are getting separated, divorced. A lot of kids are struggling with that. It's becoming much more mainstream. There's many more single parents raising children. This is something that I can definitely empathize with, being a single parent. So I recognize that the challenges that many single parents face. And I think that a lot of kids feel angry, right? They're angry, they're resentful that their family unit may be changing. Today, because of what's happening in the economy, we know that parents have to have sometimes several jobs just to make ends meet, right? And so perhaps because they're working so much, they just can't physically be as present. And so, their kids may feel abandoned, right? Or resentful. Maybe they're not feeling validated. They're not feeling heard or supported. And then they're acting out in these really self-destructive ways. And so I think that that's really important to note. So definitely changes in family structure, right? We know that gun availability is problematic. Okay. So we know that gun control, it is a piece of reducing gun violence. It's certainly not the whole picture, but it's definitely a part of it. So in my opinion, and I know that there's obviously differences of opinion on this topic, there definitely needs to be more stringent and extensive background checks conducted, right? Just to identify those if they have an extensive background check, if there is a history, if they have a proclivity to carry out violence. We want to recognize that. That way, these people are not getting access to firearms. Perhaps raising the minimum age to 21, right? Because most of these kids carrying out these acts of violence are between 14 and 18. So if we raise that age, maybe it will help to reduce the amount of people accessing these guns who shouldn't really have access to them. On the flip side, right, because there's always a different perspective, I do want to note that there are millions of gun owners in the country, right? And they're not out there committing heinous crimes. So almost half of all teenagers in this country have some sort of mental health issue. And we know that although mental health issues are not directly correlated with school violence in any way, shape, or form, many of the people carrying out these acts of violence are struggling, right? And maybe if they lack the coping skills and they lack healthy ways of dealing with stressors, right? So giving them the help that they need and really addressing mental health then will, in fact, hopefully help to mitigate violence. There's also a lack of violence prevention programs in schools. So I think that there is a disconnect, I want to say, between what is being done and how students and stakeholders need to respond. There definitely needs to be more training. We need to integrate social emotional learning more, in schools, because these are the skills that kids need to be successful in school and in life. We know that bullying is a major problem. Yearning to retaliate is clearly a problem. Wanting to feel empowered. Violence in movies and video games is a major problem, right? Because youth who are exposed to this material may feel that violence is normalized in some way, shape, or form. And they may then become more volatile themselves because they're not able to really separate virtual reality from their actual reality, right? And so that is also problematic. We know that drug and alcohol usage, right, definitely, and a increased usage in drugs has led to a increase in violence because people, maybe they're not thinking rationally, right? I think another huge factor that we really need to address is parents who are in denial, right? Maybe they don't want to address that their kid is suffering. Maybe they feel embarrassed that there's some sort of stigma, that it poorly reflects, right, their parenting skills. And so they're not getting their kids the help that they desperately need. And schools can only do so much. We are mandated reporters and we can make reports, but ultimately there needs to be more follow through to make sure that these kids are getting the support that they need, right? We know that there are times when parents are enabling their kids and they're purchasing firearms for them. So rather than helping, they're actually further, perpetuating this issue. Like, look at Ethan Crumbley, right? So he was 15 years old. He carried out that massacre at Oxford High School in Michigan, killed 4 beautiful students, injured teachers, other students. And this kid was clearly struggling. We found this out after the fact, right? But he was making drawings of guns and people lying in blood, like really gruesome, worrisome drawings, and didn't have a strong support system, appeared to be isolated, didn't have very many friends. And we come to find out that the father purchased a semi-automatic handgun for him as a gift on Black Friday. So like right around the holidays, Thanksgiving. And the student was obsessed with violence, right? So rather than getting him the help that they needed, the parents were completely enabling. And so the school called the parents in for a meeting and to talk about what their concerns were. The teacher saw these drawings and the parents refused to take the kid home and get him help. And then that same day, he carries out this massacre. So again, it goes back to, we need to really implore parents, if they see that their kids are struggling, the greatest gift is to really get them the help that they need, because that will safeguard their child and also those, who are around them, for sure.
There's one thing that has not been mentioned, and that is we used to have to visit the parents of the children.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been discontinued? Or
That's a really good question. Sometimes I know that there are some social workers, right? If there's something going on in the home, if there's a concern maybe with like truancy or absenteeism, they will do home visits. But that's typically not, and again, it really depends on school protocol, right? Because every school is going to have different protocols. But to my knowledge, that's usually only done if there's like some sort of major concern. I agree with you though. There clearly needs to be more done. We know the importance of parental involvement and getting parents, involved in the school, because that ultimately helps to promote not only their academic performance, but also their engagement, their connection, right? Having that sense of belonging, acceptance, inclusivity. So we know how important, parental involvement is. And we know that the more that parents are involved, the more successful the kids are. I can tell you that one thing I did as a counselor, many of the parents, many of the kids I worked with, it was a very high poverty school district. So transportation was a big barrier. So what I used to do is I would go into the rec center, right? And I would facilitate meetings there. I would facilitate workshops. We would have back to school nights. And we had such an amazing turnout, because we ultimately, we're there to serve our students and their families, right? So whatever we can do to help and support them, that was very, I will say, advantageous, right? For really enhancing that involvement. And I think it also, having that visibility in the community, it was very helpful, because then we had more community support too, right? Which is clearly vital for student success.
How common are school shootings?
Yeah, this is a great question, Ralph. So they are far too common, right? And we know that school shootings are just a worst nightmare across the board for all stakeholders, for parents, for kids, for teachers, for the entire community. It has such a detrimental impact on overall functioning, right? It's interesting about this question because there are different stats, right, based on various sources, but they're all in a very similar range per se. So there's this one website called Campus Safety, and they do a lot of research and they collect a lot of data about school violence. And according to Campus Safety, they said that there have been approximately 1,924 school shootings since 1970. So in the past 52 years, there have been almost 2,000 school shootings. It's unbelievable, really staggering. Since 1970, approximately 637 people have died in school shootings, and 1,734 people were injured. Okay. In 2018, this was the year that had the highest number of people killed. So the highest number of fatalities. And this was the year of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the shooting in Parkland, the Valentine's Day massacre that claimed the lives of 17 students and faculty. Probably one of the worst massacres in the history in this country. Approximately 1,100 incidents occur outside on school property, like in the parking lot, in the playground, the athletic field, and almost 700 occur inside a school building. And interestingly, the most common location for a school shooting is either the parking lot or a classroom. Most school shootings occur in the morning, followed by a sporting event or afternoon classes, which I think is really fascinating. Most of the victims, I will say, have been males. almost 1,700, and about 515 victims have been females. And also, that's really fascinating. The most common time of year for school shootings to happen is in the fall. And this may be because of different reasons, right? But perhaps because over the summer, kids are isolated, right? I think also now we're just going through a really tough time where families are struggling. This obviously impacts the entire family system, right? In terms of mental health. And so it's really, really going to be paramount for schools, specifically this coming fall, to incorporate, more prevention measures and trainings at the beginning of the school year. That way, all stakeholders are aware of policies, protocols, and really what to do if, God forbid, some sort of tragedy, takes place. We also know that the majority of time the school shooter is a student at the school. So I think that's something to also be, mindful of. And every town is another platform just in terms of getting more data here. And they also conduct extensive research on gun violence in schools. And they too found 2018, there were 105 incidents of gunfire, resulting in 61 deaths and 91 injuries nationally. In 2019, there were at least 130 incidents of gunfire. So notice that there's a steady increase there, right? Resulting in 33 deaths and almost 80 injuries. In 2020, there were 96 incidents of gunfire, resulting in 24 deaths and 43 injuries. In 2021, there were at least 202 incidents of gunfire on school grounds, leading to almost 50 deaths and 126 injuries. And in this year alone, and remember, we're just in August now, there have been at least 95 incidents of gunfire on school grounds, which is really, just totally upsetting, which has led to 40 deaths and 76 injuries nationally. And so I feel like as school shootings are becoming more and more common, we clearly have to be much more proactive rather than reactive, right, in preventing future atrocities. So what are your thoughts, Ralph, about some of these numbers and these stats?
Well, I was asking myself why, or is there any specific reason why the shootings are escalated or they escalate? Is there a reason for that?
So there's definitely a reason in terms of for the escalations. And I'm really glad that we're, talking about that, because it is such an important question. So I think there's several issues here, right? So we know that pandemic stress has definitely led to an uptick of school violence, right? So there's been an insurmountable, I want to say, amount of stress academically. Remember, like when we were going through this pandemic, these kids were out of school for over a year, right? So they lost almost a year of learning in the classroom. So they fell behind enormously academically. So that's, I think, a piece of it. Definitely the fact that kids have been isolated, right? They've been isolated from their teachers, from their peers, which has further exacerbated, I want to say, feelings of not being connected or disengagement, loneliness, resentment, right? Families, we know, are facing major financial stressors. And that has had an impact on students because they're worried about survival. So they're not as focused on, doing well in school because their basic needs are not being met. Like going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like food, water, shelter. So when those basic needs are not met, people in general are just really, really struggling. And so I definitely think the pandemic, on top of the fact that it has had an awful impact on mental health, right? So that has definitely been a part of why school violence has escalated. I think also there's been an increase in community violence, right? So there's violence taking place in schools. And I think that is reflective of what's going on in society at large. There's gun violence everywhere, all of the time. Right. And I think people are becoming, sadly, they're becoming more and more desensitized. It's like they're almost normalizing it because it's happening so frequently. And this is ultimately, this is a societal problem, right? That has infiltrated the core of everything we do, because these were once safe havens. Like, we once felt safe going to school. And I think a lot of people, there's a perpetual fear now that, it is a very scary time in this world. We know that social media has also been problematic, right? Because social media acts as a vehicle or a platform to masses where people can kind of share their threats and their plans. And social media, in many ways, it gives people a voice and a sense of control to share those plans. And we know that most kids today communicate via social media, right? More so than verbally. And so again, I think it just goes back to social media really, really needs to do a better job on monitoring what is being posted on these platforms. Another challenge I want to say with social media is that many students are posting threats or hoaxes, which is becoming really problematic. And it's really vital. We have to take every threat seriously, right? But what the FBI is saying, I was doing some research on this. They're saying that rather than screenshotting and sharing these threats, to really call the authorities immediately, because if they keep screenshotting things, it becomes more and more difficult to find out where that threat originated from, right? And so again, all threats need to be looked into in order to really verify their credibility. We know that bullying and cyberbullying has increased, right? So that definitely has led to an uptick of school violence, because we know that kids are constantly getting tormented online on social media platforms, on their phones, instant messaging, direct messaging, right? I think that there's more of a propensity for lawlessness today, where perhaps people are acting out and maybe there aren't as many consequences. And I think also the availability of information on the internet, it's kind of a blessing and a curse, right? Because many students who are isolated, they can search the internet, they can copycat, and they're getting a hold of information that we may not necessarily want them to have. And so I think all of those things have caused, a uptick or a escalation, I want to say, right, in school violence for sure. Yeah, really, really good question.
How can school shootings be prevented?
Really, really good question. So again, there are some measures in place, and I think that there are also additional measures that need to be implemented in order to further mitigate or prevent, school violence. So we know that different schools do different things to prevent gun violence. There's not a universal approach as of yet per se, right? We know that some elementary schools implement character ed programs. When I was an elementary school counselor, I did this. I implemented Learning for Life. It was an awesome program. Manualized, the kids loved it. We talked about, citizenship and friendship and responsibility and being respectful, kindness. And it's so important because the earlier that kids learn these skills, right, obviously the more successful that they will be. So integrating those character ed programs early on is going to be vital. There's one really great program with elementary school kids. It's a social emotional learning program. It's called The Leader in Me. And I know there are several elementary schools in the Carolinas who implement this program. And it talks about, being accountable and being a good leader and problem solving and all of these really, really core soft skills, right, that kids need to be successful. So that's wonderful that they're doing that so early on, right? We know that some schools are implementing anti-bullying programs. We know the importance of having anti-bullying programs because we know that bullying, how it impacts kids across the board, academically, socially, emotionally, psychologically. So we have to teach kids to be upstanders rather than bystanders, right? So if they see bullying happening, they need to learn to assert, to speak up, to provide that peer support, right? Because that will hopefully, again, help to mitigate or prevent bullying from occurring. We have to have more upstanders in the school. We know that some schools are implementing active shooter drills. I have mixed feelings on these. I think that they can be helpful in certain ways, right? In terms of preparing students and going over protocols. However, caveat being, they can also be triggering or traumatizing if these shooters, if these drills, I want to say, are being simulated, right? So if they're like really, really realistic, that can be, very anxiety provoking for many students. So again, I think giving stakeholders a heads up, going over what they're going to be doing beforehand, would be very helpful in de-escalating some of that angst. We know that some schools have metal detectors. Some schools have truancy officers. We had one when I was a counselor, and he was wonderful. He was previously in law enforcement. And I really just think having his presence there, right, helped to mitigate any type of volatile behavior. So that can definitely, be very impactful. Sandy Hook Promise has some awesome programs, really, really fantastic programs that can be implemented school-wide, K-12. And I strongly encourage school districts to look into these programs because, again, I think having violence prevention programs, we're being proactive rather than reactive, which is so important. We know the importance of creating safe school climates, and I'm sure you can speak to this, providing counseling and mental health services, and really intervening prior to violence, right?
Yes.
So what are your thoughts just in terms of having more, dialogue about gun violence in schools, having more consistent conversations?
Well, let me hook up what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
They seem to go together. What about different programs that are out there? For example, I don't remember what program we had, but it was a talking program. We went into a classroom and we talked with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can talk with whatever you want to talk about. And it seemed to work. It seems like kids were interested in voicing their own, expressing themselves,
Mm-hmm.
which our program gave kids a chance to express themselves, And the counselor had to go in and he give the teacher a leave of absence for about a half an hour, and then he would talk with the kids about, let's say, one of the programs dealt with feelings a lot,
Mm-hmm.
what kids are feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's difficult sometimes for the teachers to know what a little kid is feeling. And we gave them a chance to express their feelings.
Yeah.
And
Which is brilliant. Yeah.
they seem to enjoy it. They kind of silence it home when they come to school, shut up. And so my program works real good in Kansas City Public Schools because I talked with the kids. Tell me something you did today that gave somebody a good feeling.
Right. Empathy, right?
Empathy, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's surprising how many hands went up. Kids wanted to talk,
These kids love to share. Yeah.
And we had a way of asking the kid, asking them to listen
Mm-hmm.
to the stories of other kids. And they would listen to the stories of other kids, and I would ask them, what did you hear them say?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it worked very well for us. I think there's an incident that occurred to me where one of my kids that I work with, she was ran over by a car coming to school.
Oh my gosh.
Well, that's everybody in the school was upset
Of course.
because I think she got killed. And so
Poor baby.
when I came into the picture, I could ask kids, tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what's going on in your mind. How do you feel? And we would work through that because there's a lot happening when little kids can talk out their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So our school had that program going. Do you know of any other programs where they have that set in place to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a lot of times counselors today, even if it's not a program per se, they do these like restorative justice circles. And very similar to what you're saying is the kids sit in a circle and they're just having open dialogue, right?
Right.
About what's going on, what challenges they're facing, how they're feeling. They're going over emotion identification, which is so critical. And like you said, I think that's such an important skill. And this really ties into social emotional learning, which we'll talk about. But so many times, I feel like these days kids just want to feel heard. They want to feel understood. They want to feel validated. They want to feel that sense of importance or belonging or acceptance, right? And just by giving them a platform to share how they're doing, and then to have other people say, you know what, I feel a really similar way. And that builds trust and that builds connectivity, which builds safety and inclusivity and a more conducive space, right, to fostering success. So just by, like you said, just by having open dialogue and by talking about these SEL skills is so vital. I actually just wrote a book. It's all about social emotional learning and school violence. And it's a really, really fascinating read. The book talks about in the first part of the book, it really talks about just a overview of, why gun violence is happening and perpetrator characteristics and so on and so forth. And then the last half of the book is all about experiential activities, right? So activities that school counselors can implement in their comprehensive counseling program to teach their K-12 students these soft skills, because that's what it goes back to. And it really talks about everything you're talking about active listening, talking about problem solving, talking about empathy and compassion and putting yourself in that person's shoes and imagining how would you feel, right, if that happened to you? How would you feel? How would you react? How can you navigate that? We have to teach kids how to collaborate, how to problem solve, how to be motivated, how to be optimistic, how to be leaders, how to be accountable and taking ownership, right? How to assert themselves, how to communicate. That's such a huge piece of it because, like I said, I think so much nowadays, all of this communication is taking place online rather than in person. And so a lot of these kids need help building those interpersonal skills. Right. And so social emotional learning is really all about teaching these kids the skills that they really need to control their emotions, to demonstrate empathy, right, to make healthy choices. And this is what counselors need to be doing. Teachers can do this by all means, right? But they need to do this really intentionally. So counselors can do this in individual counseling, small group, classroom. And these are the topics they need to address. Talking about bullying, having conversations about grief and loss, talking about self-esteem, right? Empowerment, diversity. This is ultimately what will help to create a safer space and more well-adjusted, happier, more communicative kids, because they're going to have a space to share, right? And to raise awareness. And that is such a gift. Yeah, for sure.
They are saying that this seems like uniquely an American problem. What are foreign schools like with respect to the kids?
Interesting. Yeah. So, this is a really interesting question. In my opinion, and again, this is just how I feel, I really believe that gun violence is problematic more universally, right? However, we do see that school shootings are predominantly taking place in this country. And again, I think it's due to various things. There's not just one reason, right? Gun violence is become such a highly politicized issue, right? And that's so unfortunate because I think that ultimately just causes more divisiveness, more animosity. I think if you ask people with a more liberal stance, they're going to have a very different thought than you would if you ask those with a more conservative stance, right? But at the end of the day, I think that gun violence it is a bipartisan issue, right? And we really need to have both parties working together to find realistic solutions because this is a humanitarian crisis. It's not about this party or that party. This impacts all political factions, right? And no one is invincible. And so I think we really need to unify as a country and put those differences aside and really work together to create policies that will protect our, precious, these vulnerable populations for sure.
Seems like to me gun violence is in and out of the school.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the police deal with gun violence all the time.
All the time.
But we don't deal with it all the time. We deal with it sometimes. And a lot of parents have guns that the kids get and use.
Mm-hmm.
What about across racial lines? What is the incidence of that in terms of gun violence?
That's an interesting question. Well, we know that gun violence is taking place more so in urban cities, right? We know how prevalent gun violence is in more high poverty. There seems to be more crime in higher poverty cities, which is why I think that we do need more funding in terms of law enforcement. This is a social justice issue, right? We need to make sure that regardless if someone is living in a high poverty area or a much more affluent area, all people have access to the same resources and support and protection. That's the bottom line. So I think that's what this really comes down to is regardless of SES status or race or ethnicity, like gun violence is impacting everyone. No one is invincible to this, but I do think for sure that gun violence is taking place more heavily, I want to say, in more urban areas with higher poverty, and perhaps because it's so prevalent that there just may not be enough law enforcement to support. And so again, we need to have more funding, right? We need to have more funding for cops, for trained mental health professionals, for everyone working together, because it does take a village. This is not a one-man show. This is a very complex issue. So all systems need to be working together collaboratively to provide support. Absolutely. That's my opinion. The other thing I do want to note, though, is that, even if we have more gun control, right? And I do think we need to have much more extensive background checks. We know that we have got to have more extensive background checks to really make sure that firearms are not being purchased by people who should not have them. It is important to note, though, that I feel like if someone is enraged enough to carry out some kind of massacre, having laws, I don't know if that person is necessarily concerned about that law, because many of these perpetrators, they may lack a really strong moral compass. So in their minds, if they're going to access a gun, they may find a way to do so despite having, laws in place, right? So that's just, I think, something important to address. I think that we need to have more physical safety measures, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. whether it be like having more security cameras, having more guards, metal detectors in schools, cameras maybe right in the hallway or stairwell. Having internal door locks, I think, is really critical. That way the kids or the teacher doesn't have to leave their classroom, right? And so those are just some physical safety measures. Did you guys have those in your school at all? Anything like that?
In some schools they have.
In some schools, yeah. Yeah, it needs to be, I think it needs to be more consistent and more universal. Like every school needs to have these things in order to really have that overarching reduction, I want to say. We know the importance of having positive constraints, like we've talked about this, in terms of having those positive peer relationships, right? Having mentors, because that ultimately, promotes greater engagement and involvement, and there's greater inclusivity. We want to assist those kids who are struggling. We want to offer mentorship and tutoring, right? We want to use a peer pal or some kind of buddy system. I used to do that all the time as an elementary school counselor, and the kids loved it. And they were working on all of those soft skills without even realizing it, like the collaboration, communicating, problem solving, right? We have to motivate them to form that connection. We have to have that inclusivity, and we have to involve parents, right? We have to have anti-bullying programs. We know how important that is. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is such an awesome resource. They have wonderful resources on bullying, on diversity. And there's one program that they have for bullying. It's called No Place for Hate. And I strongly encourage schools nationwide to implement this program. There are other bullying programs like Always bullying program. Steps to Respect is one that I use. And they all really work to promote having that zero tolerance policy, right? They talk about the long-term effects of bullying. They teach empathy and compassion. And they really have shown to mitigate school violence. So they are evidence-based, and they have absolutely shown to have a positive impact. We have to have more funding. We know that. There is so much money in this country that's spent on so many different things, and I'm sure you could speak to this. But we need to put more money towards mental health, right? We have to have more educators, more school counselors, because that way, if we have more people, we're going to be better able to identify, those kids who are struggling. We have to do more with breaking down codes of silence. We know that kids have so much information. They know a lot more than we do. They have access to social media. They hear things on the bus in their community. So we have to have ways for them to come forward, whether it's anonymously or not, to share their concerns, right? So like one thing I did is I had this worry box, and it was like a shoe box, and it had this like open slit in it, and kids could just drop off. They could write their name. They certainly didn't have to, but they can tell me, hey, this is what's going on. Just wanted to give you a heads up, right? And had they not done that, I would have never known. So we have to create, again, you have to build rapport, because that builds trust. You have to be visible, because that, again, helps them to open up and to disclose and to feel safe enough doing so, right? So visibility is key. But yeah, we have to find ways to break down codes of silence. That is, absolutely paramount. In terms of, what people can do, I think that the more involved families are, we know that the more successful kids will be. Research has showed this time and time again in terms of, parental and family involvement. I think it's really important to work closely with the school counselor, other critical stakeholders, if a kid is struggling academically, behaviorally, socially, emotionally. We know the more people who are working together to support that child, the more successful they will be. And it's also really important, I think, if family members see that their kid is being cyberbullied, this must be reported and documented. Many schools have a HIB policy, harassment and intimidation bullying, not all, but typically bullying incidents need to be documented and reported within 24 hours. That way it can be looked into. I think if parents and family members are aware that students are posting threatening messages, this information must be shared with school administrators as well as the authorities. That way, steps can be taken to really safeguard all of those involved, because that can save lives. And every threat needs to be taken seriously. I think that parents and family members need to advocate, right? They need to advocate more for additional mental health support in schools in order to have more positive outcomes and to reduce violence. I think that's really, really important. And again, I think if parents or family members are aware that their kids are struggling, work with the school counselor, right? Utilize those resources, collaborate with them, right? Because they can provide support and referrals and help, especially to those who perhaps need to go see a mental health counselor, right? Who may need more intensive support. And that is so critical. We need, I think another thing parents and family members can do, and Ralph, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is to have more dialogue. We have to communicate. And I know you said that before, like kids want to feel heard. Parents need to be in tune with these kids emotionally, how they are feeling, if they're struggling, right? I think that they need to have talks on a daily basis. I always talk to my 8-year-old. He doesn't always tell me much, but I always talk to him. There's always dialogue, right? And I think taking a vested interest in these kids' lives is so vital, and transparency is key, because knowing that there's that strong rapport, right? Knowing that there's that safe place, that bond, and that these kids are unconditionally accepted, that is so critical for having that open and authentic dialogue, right? I think it's really important also for parents to emphasize accountability. I think so many times parents want to fix problems for their kids, right? But kids need to learn how to problem solve on their own. So teaching kids how to be accountable and really looking at life experiences as teachable moments, right? Like, what did you learn? What can you potentially do differently moving forward? Because there's always going to be room for improvement.
There was a school where my daughter and son went, and the teacher and the principal felt that it was okay for me to come up and have lunch with them. Have lunch with them, sit down and talk with them, and meet their little friends and whatnot.
Yeah.
And that was a nice outing. My daughter, son loved it, and so did I. Parents have to make time for that kind of thing.
They do. Yeah. And beautifully said. And it's so important to have, whether it's like family back to school night or literacy night. One thing I did, and the parents love this, it was Marvelous Mothers and Fabulous Fathers. And we did this every year at the end of the year, and it was awesome. And we would cater in food, and we would have music, and the kids would perform. And it was awesome. And we had like the best turnout. And the parents always said how much they appreciated how we loved their kids and supported them, and how, they were always celebrated. And it definitely fostered greater connectivity. The kids felt supported. It was so empowering. It was just really like one of the most inspirational things I did. And I think it was perhaps like one of the most impactful things we did for the school, at large, is really doing whatever we could do to enhance that visibility, and to have that family engagement is so critical.
I have worked on a book, and it was called Street Life.
Oh, I love that.
And I was going to give kids a good understanding of street life. That street life is different from school life.
Mm-hmm.
You got to leave certain behaviors outside of the school. But you have to understand what street life is. We talked about street language, street gangs, street violence, and another thing we talked about, and they seemed to like that. But I had to be very shrewd in explaining to kids that, you know, school is a microcosm of society.
Mm-hmm.
And what we are learning in school is to make us better in society,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So that worked out pretty well, but I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's fascinating. And to be able to kind of make that connection and to raise their awareness, right? And to help them make healthier choices.
Right.
That way they can ultimately, you know, reach their fullest potential and be the best version of themselves. I applaud you. I think that's amazing. And that's really important, I think, for kids to be aware of, because I love the fact that you've been so honest and raw and authentic and real, because that trustworthiness is ultimately, that's what builds relationships. And without that trust, there is no growth. We know that.
Right.
So they're lucky to have you. Yeah. Awesome.
I was
Thanks
lucky
so much
to
for
have them
sharing.
too. Okay.
Thanks so much for sharing that. That was great. Thank you, Ralph. This was such a once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm so honored and humbled that I got a chance to speak with you today and had this amazing conversation and dialogue. And I feel like I have learned so much from you. So thank you for imparting your wisdom and your brilliance. And it's just been so lovely getting to speak with you. You're just absolutely darling.
Well, thank you.
And I think to myself,